As dawn broke across the Eastern Front in the winter of 1943, the bitter cold etched itself into the very fabric of war. The harsh landscape was pockmarked with remnants of battles long past, the carcasses of vehicles frozen in time alongside the desolation of abandoned trenches. Yet amidst this frozen theater of conflict, the German Wehrmacht introduced a new weapon intended to level the odds against the ever-encroaching Soviet forces: the Panzerfaust. This anti-tank weapon, designed to be man-portable, struck a stark contrast to the cumbersome artillery pieces that had previously dictated engagements. It was compact, simple to operate, and possessed a significant punch against the armored behemoths of the Soviet army. However, as the German soldiers soon discovered, the Panzerfaust's effectiveness was mired in tactical shortcomings. Its design allowed for a single shot that could penetrate the armor of nearly all Soviet tanks, but the realities of battlefield deployment revealed significant flaws. The weapon featured a limited range of approximately 30 to 60 meters, depending on the model and conditions. In the blustery winds and swirling snow of the Eastern Front, the effective range was often diminished further. For a soldier entrenched in the whirling chaos of combat, emerging from cover to utilize the Panzerfaust was akin to drawing a death sentence, as the return fire from Soviet forces remained unyielding and relentless. In tactical terms, the Germans faced an increasing challenge in navigating the open expanses of the Eastern Front. Soviet tactics had evolved to meet the German threat. They utilized massed formations and overwhelming numbers, effectively compensating for weaknesses in individual equipment through sheer volume of fire. This approach rendered the Panzerfaust's intended usage impractical, as German crews often found themselves exposed and vulnerable after firing a single shot. Such an engagement would immediately attract the ire of Soviet tankers, whose instinct was to return fire with little hesitation, marking the position of any enemy combatants. Within seconds, the battle could shift from a tactical advantage to a lethal disadvantage. As German troops continued to deploy the Panzerfaust in combat, the doctrine of usage began to illustrate a grim reality. While the weapon provided a formidable counter to Soviet armor, it demanded innovative tactics to mitigate its shortcomings. Soldiers were urged to utilize the terrain to their advantage, waiting for the enemy to close within the weapon's effective range before taking action. However, this method required not only robust training, but also a degree of bravery that could easily lead to fatalities. The soldiers often found themselves assembled in ambush positions, with orders to remain concealed until the opportune moment. Yet the longer they lingered, the more dangerous the waiting became amidst the chaos of shifting frontline conditions. The tactical decisions being made were not merely matters of military strategy. They were imbued with personal stakes. Each soldier carrying a Panzerfaust understood the fragility of life in this relentless theater of war. The psychological toll was evident as they faced both the excitement of a potential kill and the dread of imminent return fire. Moreover, the reality of comrades falling around them, some killed or grievously injured moments after the gunfire ceased, contributed significantly to the increasing strain on the human spirit. As the season shifted, hope grew faint. The winter of 1943 turned into a harsh lesson in survival, where the bold maneuver of employing the Panzerfaust became a double-edged sword. The impact of the weapon was evident during engagements such as the Battle of Kursk, where massed Soviet armor clashed with German defenses in strategically pivotal territories. Hundreds of Panzerfausts were fired in an effort to halt the Soviet offensive, yet the return fire would target the German positions fiercely, punishing their numerical disadvantages. Troops learned to adapt, some attempting to reposition quickly after firing, while others found themselves forming small, mobile teams to engage and evade. However, the Panzerfaust's ability to inflict damage started to dwindle as Soviet tactics adapted to subvert the effectiveness of the weapon. Armored vehicles began employing screens of infantry who would provide support, amplifying the danger faced by German troops. As Soviet forces began to regroup and change their own strategic approaches, it became clear that the initial effectiveness of the Panzerfaust, though profound in its design, was no match for the evolving nature of warfare on the Eastern Front. The Soviets augmented their own anti-tank capabilities and enhanced their armor systems, which meant that while German troops fired their Panzerfausts with precision, they were met with increasingly fortified counterparts. Efforts to maintain the momentum of the offensive were soon overshadowed by a need to recalibrate strategies. The combination of returns fire and the increasing number of Soviet reinforcements heightened the stakes for the German troops, who experienced a degradation in morale as their frontline campaigns began to falter. Compounding these challenges were persistent logistical issues affecting the Wehrmacht supply lines. As the Eastern Front stretched longer and deeper into Soviet territory, access to weaponry and munitions became more cumbersome, further complicating the already strained supply chain. Ammunition resupplies could take days to reach frontline troops, and as the likelihood of confronting Soviet tanks increased, soldiers were left with limited options on how to engage effectively. The Panzerfaust, in this sense, became a symbol of desperation coupled with ingenuity. While it offered a fighting chance against armored threats, its limited availability and vulnerabilities warped the operational effectiveness of the soldiers employing it. As one could observe from the trenches scattered throughout this war, the human cost of these tactical deficiencies was immeasurable. Adorned with the scars of war, the soldiers bore not only the visible marks, but the psychological burdens of uncertainty and fear. The Panzerfaust, an innovative weapon in principle, found itself ensnared within the bitter realities of combat on the Eastern Front. It etched tales of valor into the fabric of war, while simultaneously serving as a grim reminder of the ever-looming specter of death that awaited any soldier brave enough to wield it. In reflecting upon the fate of the Panzerfaust and those tasked with employing it, the darker truths of warfare unravel: the interplay of technology and human endeavor, the shifts between hope and despair, and the sheer volume of sacrifice that so often defines the annals of history. As the East pushed ever closer towards the exhibits of conflict and the outcomes of military stratagem unfolded, the Panzerfaust would remain a compelling narrative of technological promise and the ruthless reality of its application under fire. Ultimately, the German troops' experience with the Panzerfaust serves as a poignant lesson on the importance of tactical flexibility, training, and the invaluable human instinct for survival against unrelenting odds. As the winter of 1944 descended upon the Eastern Front, soldiers of the Wehrmacht braced for the relentless combat that would define one of the most brutal phases of World War II. The Panzerfaust, originally heralded as a revolutionary anti-tank weapon, emerged as a makeshift solution to the armored might of the Red Army. However, the reality of its limited range and effectiveness in the face of overwhelming Soviet advances began to unravel the initial optimism. The battlefield had grown exceedingly complex, marked by both the ferocity of engagement and the unyielding conditions imposed by the harsh climate. These combatants, clad in tattered uniforms and weary from prolonged fighting, offered their last resolve against the obstinate Soviet armored units that rolled across the landscape like a torrent of steel. The logistics of warfare invariably played a pivotal role in shaping the fate of those wielding the Panzerfaust on the front lines. As the German command grappled with logistical challenges, the delivery of munitions became a high-stakes endeavor fraught with danger. Supply routes often stretched precariously close to newly established front lines, perpetually under threat from Soviet scouts and artillery fire. This made the resupply of essential weaponry, such as the Panzerfaust, though small and portable, an act of calculated risk. As the inevitability of battle loomed, each Panzerfaust that found its way into the hands of soldiers was a beacon of hope, albeit one flickering and dim in the ever-increasing darkness of impending conflict. Field reports began to illustrate the stark implications of the weapon's tactical deployment. Soldiers, once enthused by the idea of easily dispatching Soviet T-34 tanks, often found themselves faced with the realities of battlefield engagement. With an effective range of approximately 30 meters, the Panzerfaust required users to not only close the distance on enemy armor, but to do so with the meticulous dance of stealth and precision. A miscalculation could quickly become a fatal error. Trained on the nuances of detonation and trajectory, Troops soon learned that their survival hinged not merely on their ability to fire the weapon, but on how they approached their target. Inevitably, any Soviet tank crew that survived the first shot retaliated aggressively, unleashing a barrage of fire with devastating efficiency. The resulting casualties painted a grim tableau of war. The camaraderie and spirit of survival eroded beneath the unforgiving reality that limited their chances for survival. While doctrine emphasized aggression, the oppressive Soviet push demanded adaptation. As German units retreated or fortified already tenuous positions, they were forced to devise innovative tactics that made effective use of the Panzerfaust. Soldiers began to employ ambush tactics, wherein a small squad of men would lie in wait, tucked away in the ruins of bombed-out buildings or behind debris-strewn landscapes. This defensive posture allowed for an initial shot at approaching enemy armor, hoping to disrupt the armored advance and inflict meaningful damage before the inevitable counterstrike. The effectiveness of such tactics lay in their unpredictability, a strategy that provided fragile pockets of hope amidst overwhelming odds. However, the human cost of this infernal cycle of adaptation was staggering. Many faced not just the grim specter of death from enemy fire, but also the merciless chill of the winter air, which gnawed at their bones and sapped their motivation. The psychological toll of warfare, witnessing comrades fall, carrying the burden of survival, and confronting the unyielding specter of their own mortality, weighed heavily upon these men. In the shattered remnants of the Eastern Front, the sounds of soldiers whispering words of comfort mingled with cries of agony, each round fired, each explosion resonating as a chilling reminder of their transience in the roaring chaos of combat. This struggle transcended simple military confrontation. It became a war of human endurance. The Panzerfaust also unveiled the rift between expectation and reality in the context of command strategies. High-ranking officials planned with a focus on armor superiority, often underestimating the resolve of Soviet forces. Thus, as the winter stretched forth, German commands continued to deploy units languishing under inadequate supplies and insufficiently trained soldiers, often accompanied by diminishing morale. Continuous setbacks begged questions of leadership and foresight as troops, pushed beyond breaking points, began to lose faith in both their command and the very weapons intended to ensure their survival. With tanks advancing and German infantry retreating, the Panzerfaust transformed from a weapon of hope into a somber specter of increased vulnerability. As frontline units held onto the Panzerfaust, they soon became grappling reflections of their time, caught in a vicious cycle of conflict driven by ideology and human sacrifice. Stories emerged of brothers in arms, bound by shared hardships, seeking solace in each other's company during the long nights spent huddling in frostbitten positions, their thoughts invariably swinging between longing for home and the pursuit of occupations unfathomable, defying both logic and reason. The struggle against the tide of despair and the raw instinct for survival evoked a sense of brotherhood unparalleled in warfare, creating a narrative of connection that ran deeply within the fabric of harrowing encounters. This linguistic tapestry of survival, heroism, and loss further illustrates the impact of individual actions, permeating not only the historical chronology, but also capturing the texture of the human condition amidst catastrophic events. Each soldier's personal story, however seemingly small against the overarching tide of war, added an essential layer to this intricate narrative. The visceral experiences of men armed with Panzerfausts nestled in the ruins of a winter wasteland would continue to echo in subsequent generations, imparting stark lessons upon the dynamics of combat, technology, and the unyielding pursuit of hope. The tragic irony of the Panzerfaust's utilization serves as a reminder that even remarkable technology cannot alter the path of fate in war. As the Eastern Front recedes into history, it remains essential to evaluate the sacrifices that shaped both individual lives and the larger narrative of conflict. The Wehrmacht's struggle with the Panzerfaust encapsulated more than merely a battle against tanks or enemy positions. It revealed the harrowing dance of tactics and the indomitable spirit of humanity confronting oblivion. For those seeking to understand the bitter complexities etched within first-hand accounts of war, witnessing the resilience of the human spirit amidst chaos conducts an invitation to reflect. Share your thoughts with us, and join our ongoing journey into the depth of history as we explore the destinies intertwined within the crucible of conflict. Subscribe and comment to unveil the layers of war narratives that shape our understanding today. As the bitter winds swept across the snow-laden fields of Eastern Europe, the situation for German troops became increasingly dire as they faced not only the brutal Russian winter, but also a formidable enemy that was keenly aware of their tactics and emerging weaponry. The Panzerfaust, a handheld anti-tank weapon, represented an innovative yet desperate measure born from necessity, evolving under the duress of resource shortages and overwhelming logistical challenges. Initially heralded for its simplicity and effectiveness against Soviet armor, the Panzerfaust would expose profound vulnerabilities inherent in its design, particularly its limited range. Deployed primarily by infantry units, soldiers were trained to use the weapon against advancing enemy tanks. Its anti-armor capabilities could manifest success on the battlefield, yet as many soldiers would come to realize, victory was often overshadowed by the inherent risks attached to engaging in such close-quarter obsolescence. At the front lines, the expected confrontations with tanks led to harrowing encounters as soldiers armed with the Panzerfaust prepped for combat. As they positioned themselves among the debris of destroyed buildings, razed fields, and abandoned vehicles, the familiar sounds of artillery announced the approach of Soviet armor. Trained to remain inconspicuous, German infantry patiently awaited their moment to strike while navigating the psychological confines of fear and adrenaline. The operation of the Panzerfaust, while ostensibly straightforward, with the user merely needing to point, aim, and launch, demanded not just physical skill, but also an acute awareness of battlefield dynamics. Miscalculations introduced heightened risks, as firing the weapon normally drew immediate enemy fire. The soldiers recognized that a fleeting moment to incapacitate a tank could simultaneously reveal their positions, marking them targets in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Strategically, the German high command underestimated the agile tactics employed by Soviet forces in countering the Panzerfaust. While the weapon's 100-meter effective range was sufficient for ambush scenarios, it was insufficient to encourage offensive movements against armored divisions that ranged well canopy and made tactical advances in greater cover. The attrition of shifting tactics became evident as Soviet commanders, aware of the Panzerfaust's limitations in range, devised methods to engage enemies from fortified distances. Soviet tanks, such as the T-34, were designed with sloped armor and superior mobility that rendered them less susceptible to close-quarter engagements, an escalating challenge for German infantry attempting to defend their positions. Logistically, the reliance on the Panzerfaust signified a broader framework of the declining resources available to the Wehrmacht. As the war dragged on, factories struggled to maintain production, and essential supplies dwindled under the pressure of Allied bombings. The Panzerfaust became a makeshift response, a symbol of desperation rather than a tactical advantage. Troops increasingly faced the dilemma of armament adequacy, grappling with the comforts of antiquated weaponry compared to the futility of making do with faulty supplies. This reliance exacerbated the mental strain on soldiers, who found themselves not just fighting an enemy, but battling the creeping reality of scarcity and impending despair. As engagements intensified, the aftermath of Panzerfaust confrontations painted a grim picture of attrition. The bitter truth became evidenced by an ever-growing list of casualties. Soldiers wounded in the line of fire often found themselves trapped in a brain-numbing state of alertness. Every explosion that rang out initiated an uneasy interplay of fellow soldiers freezing to look back and ascertain the well-being of companions, while simultaneously weighing their response to the next barrage of enemy fire. The results of these encounters ranged from the fleeting exhilaration of striking a tank to the shattering fear of mortality, as the very spirit of brotherhood was put to rigorous tests. Meanwhile, the psychological toll of using the Panzerfaust became pronounced. The fragility of combat camaraderie was put under high pressure, as soldiers witnessed death and injury all around them. Flares of pride from their ability to disable enemy vehicles were overshadowed by the harsh reality of their immediate mortality. With the weapon in hand, men found themselves localizing their existence to the precarious outcomes of their desperate measures. Survival hinged not merely on technical prowess, but increasingly upon an unyielding determination to endure in the face of continual losses. The innate human instinct to persist bore witness to harsh paradoxes. Each triumphant moment rendered bereavement palpable as friends fell around them, each explosion echoing both triumph and despair. Within command circles, tributes to the Panzerfaust's tactical value met growing skepticism, as reports of its efficacy contrasted with the increasing effectiveness of Soviet tactics. Leaders debated whether their troops' losses outweighed any perceived advantage the weapon conferred against Soviet forces. As winter encroached deeper into the Eastern Front, the effectiveness of heavy tanks and artillery slowly waned against the elements, structuring the narrative to pivot from battlefield prowess to survival. Some commanders attempted to reintegrate traditional logistical supplies into the forefront, pushing for the reclamation of greater resources and adapting training protocols to better account for the psychological strain inflicted on their troops. In the grand landscape of the Eastern Front, the introduction of the Panzerfaust ultimately echoed a vital lesson about the military-industrial complex, caught in the throes of war. As the German soldiers, enduring the harsh environmental and psychological realities of combat, grappled with tactics that shifted from aggression to mere survival against an encroaching tide, one cannot ignore the raw human sacrifices that tethered them to a world defined by agony and uncertainty. The experiences of these men lent texture to dispassionate statistics, unfolding a rigorous testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare, persisted by innovation, yet shadowed by the despair of inadequate preparations. In retrospect, the Panzerfaust's implementation, while an apparent flash of ingenuity steeped in necessity, unspooled a narrative undeniably intertwined with tragedy. As many soldiers would later attest, facing a relentless enemy from manic positions served to reinforce their own fragility, igniting reflections that would resonate throughout decades to come. In defining combat on the Eastern Front, the Panzerfaust stands not only as a tool of warfare, but more critically as an emblem of the human condition, an illustration of hope and dread, ingenuity battling with the immutable grip of fate, unraveling at the hands of man amid the chaos of relentless conflict. As winter deepened, the landscape of the Eastern Front morphed into a treacherous battleground, characterized by an unforgiving blend of frozen earth and relentless skirmishes. The Panzerfaust, heralded as a revolutionary weapon by German military officials for its ability to take out Soviet armor, soon revealed the stark limitations imposed by its short range. Contrived under the impetus of diminishing industrial resources and the pressing need to respond to the armored juggernaut of the Red Army, this handheld anti-tank weapon provided a semblance of hope, a fleeting advantage within a protracted struggle. Yet the very nature of warfare demanded that its innovations be tested not just in theory, but in the chaotic crucible of actual combat. For German troops carrying the weight of the Panzerfaust as they faced Soviet advances, each launch was more than just an engagement of military might. It was an act of desperation amid profound psychological tolls. As Soviet forces, emboldened by early winter successes and reinforced by equipment hastily supplied from their industrial heartlands, pressed their offensive, German commanders were caught in a vice of tactical anxiety. The Panzerfaust, with its compact design, was easy to transport through the labyrinthine forests, but as troops found themselves uncomfortably close to enemy positions, they quickly learned that the weapon's effective range did little to insulate them from return fire. Reports emerged of infantrymen attempting to close the distance to unleash their potentially devastating shots, only to fall prey to Soviet snipers or mortars. Each engagement illustrated a disheartening truth. The fighting spirit of the German soldier often collided with the cold, unforgiving reality of strategically flawed combat conditions. The Germans, aware of each lost life, contributing to an inexorable tide against them, initiated new strategies that blended guerrilla-style tactics with traditional warfare. Small units operating independently in the dense forests, laying ambushes instead of engaging in frontal assaults. These tactics shifted the nature of combat, transforming the battlefield into a psychological minefield, where fear and claustrophobia stalked the men in uniform. The small, agile formations were now intended to capitalize on the element of surprise, aiming to leverage the element of uncertainty to negate their inherent disadvantages. However, the complexities of logistics became paramount. The supply lines that crisscrossed through the winter landscape struggled against the weight of harsh conditions. Snow-laden paths degrading transport vehicles and impeding the movement of essential supplies, further complicating an already perilous scenario. The Panzerfaust, while designed to empower soldiers with self-sufficiency against enemy armor, became emblematic of a logistical paradox. Troops were often tempted to eschew traditional ammunition in favor of the Panzerfaust's simpler deployment. Yet, without proper support systems in place, many found themselves stranded and threatened, cut off from their lines, and forced to navigate the bleak terrain for days under fire, plagued by the gnawing dread of isolation amid the vastness of the front. Fuel shortages gnawed at the efficiency of the remaining armored units, leaving soldiers with a collection of half-finished strategic diagrams that reflected not just hopeful plans, but the haunting specter of what could no longer be accomplished amidst dwindling resources. Each expectation was now punctuated by trepidation, every maneuver overshadowed by the knowledge of rapid Soviet reinforcements and resilience. Throughout this ordeal, the human element permeated the soldiers' experiences, often crystallized in haunting stories of courage intertwined with tragic loss. The psychological toll surpassed mere physical exhaustion. Soldiers wrestled with the psychological burden of responsibility for the lives of their comrades. Each successful engagement meant one more chance to compensate for spiraling failures in command decisions, shifting the pressure towards the individual soldier who now bore the weight of collective desperation. Frequently, units would return from operations carrying not just equipment, but the indelible marks of harrowing engagements. Shell-shocked veterans, traumatized by loss, leading to a fracturing morale that would ripple through the ranks. In stark contrast, the Soviets were likewise evolving their strategies. With every successful counteroffensive, they adapted to guerrilla tactics that reflected a shrewd appreciation of terrain and movement. The successful Soviet penetrations through frozen forests and urban ruins rapidly escalated the confrontation, as their resolve to retake lost territory fortified their numerical advantages. Nevertheless, these gains were not without cost. The increasingly lethal negotiations of combat conditions bred a heightened sense of caution among Soviet soldiers, often mirroring the same psychological erosion witnessed within German ranks. Yet as battles raged, senior command decisions in the German High Command were plagued by contradictions of necessity and the stark reality of attrition. Propagandized promises of victory and superiority waded through the grim tides of loss, exacerbating rifts within the ranks, often leading to divisive sentiments among officers who witnessed firsthand the differences between doctrine and the brutal truths of the battlefield. The Panzerfaust became a palpable symbol of such disparities, hailed as a herald of ingenuity, yet condemned to show only fleeting victories in the face of overwhelming return fire, often guiding German forces into scenarios wrought with loss, not triumph. Days turned into weeks, and the constant refrain of incoming Soviet artillery merged into the freezing air of regular life, each vibration a reminder of their vulnerability. The Panzerfaust was effectively rendered both a weapon of innovative potential and an albatross around the necks of its wielders. They could target advancing tanks but faced the daunting task of doing so often, under the unrelenting scrutiny of deadly Soviet fire. The heat of battle illuminated not just the human capability for violence, but stripped away layers to reveal the raw essence of desperation, where hope transcended into deep-seated terror. As the winter dragged on, commanders were forced to confront a solemn truth regarding the Panzerfaust. Its potential had been stymied not merely by enemy advancements, but by a confluence of human frailty, technical limitations, and logistical failures that became characteristic of the Eastern Front. Each launch was laced with the bittersweet realization of survival. Behind the clamor, the echoes of stories of sacrifice, shattered dreams, and the agonizing recall of brotherhood in arms persisted. Thus, amid the snowfall, German soldiers clung to the line between despair and determination, enveloped in a relentless struggle against both tangible and intangible foes, fueling a tragic narrative that epitomized the harsh realities of warfare. A tale wherein every weapon wielded spoke not only of the promise of victory, but also of the encroaching shadows of defeat. The amalgamation of fierce desperation and the crushing reality of logistical shortcomings painted a disturbing portrait for the German forces on the Eastern Front. Experimentation with the Panzerfaust became emblematic of the larger issues at play. While its designers envisioned a new age of anti-tank warfare, the soldiers bearing it into battle grappled with flaws that would ultimately undermine its efficacy. The Panzerfaust's design, initially promising, presented limitations in its operational range, stripping the soldiers of a crucial element of surprise necessary for survival. With a maximum effective range of approximately 30 to 60 meters, its deployment became a tactical balancing act, forcing German infantry to inch dangerously closer to the advancing Soviet armor, a strategy that often resulted in catastrophic casualties from return fire. German commanders, grappling with the relentless Soviet counteroffensive, recognized the challenges posed not merely by tank formations, but by coordinated infantry tactics that often followed the armored columns. These Soviet troops, hardy and resolute, leveraged their superiority in numbers and artillery to encircle and neutralize isolated German positions, dissecting their defenses with surgical precision. The desperation of German planners led to a shift in strategy as they attempted to optimize the Panzerfaust's use by embedding small infantry units within the larger formations, aiming to transform these men into specialized anti-armor teams. Such organizations allowed for focused assaults against Soviet tank columns while attempting to mitigate potential exposure to artillery bombardments. However, despite these adjustments, they could not mask the overarching climate of dread. Stories circulated among the German ranks about colleagues who had dared use the Panzerfaust in fierce engagements, tales laced with tragic humor, yet underpinned with a collective acknowledgement of death's omnipresence. Individual soldiers recalled clutching the weapon, praying that their shot found its mark before their own existence was extinguished by the thunder of Soviet guns. The symptomatic dread permeated through the ranks, not merely concerning the weapon's limitations, but as a reflection of the overall moral and physical disintegration of the once formidable Wehrmacht. Men who had once marched with unshakable confidence forward now found themselves mired in a cycle of fear, confronting the harrowing specter of their impending fate with every ill-fated launch. Widespread reports of near misses permeated the unit's fabric, as many soldiers, haphazardly educated on the Panzerfaust's operation, often miscalibrated their shots or failed to account adequately for the weapon's trajectory. The heavy backblast and resulting recoil struck fear not only in the hearts of those who witnessed the initial launch, but in the unfortunate operators, who found their own positions exposed under heavy enemy surveillance. The grim realization struck as they recognized that the Panzerfaust, while tactical in its design, lacked the range to accommodate the shifting dynamics of a rapidly evolving battlefield. This limitation effectively rendered it a paradox, a double-edged sword whose only companions were fear and uncertainty. Logistically, the supply chain faced its own challenges. The influx of Panzerfausts, while desperately needed, could not sufficiently meet the demands of the frontline troops. Fields choked with snow-inhibited transport, while Soviet air superiority frequently disrupted supply lines, rendering mobilization increasingly laborious. Substantial shipments were sunk or destroyed before reaching eager hands. Many a German soldier thus found themselves in the shaming reality of wielding outdated weaponry, their allocation stripped down to inferior projectiles as German factories struggled to produce the ideal model and quantities. The weight of their dwindling resources weighed heavily, and a significant psychological toll set in. Each day brought with it the specter of hunger, abandonment, and defeat. As the months meandered on, the audacity of Russian offensives did not relent. The Soviets, adapting to the situation, began installing additional layers of protection on their tanks, notably increasing the strength of the armor on their T-34s, rendering even strategic hits ineffective against newer models. Soviet commanders built on their successes, employing a wealth of tactics designed to bait Panzerfaust units into revealing their positions before retaliating with concentrated artillery barrages. Encirclement and attrition became the order of the day, while German infantry fell prey to a warfare season that had become one not just of weapons, but of relentless willpower. The psychological landscape shifted inexorably. Every hesitant soldier now faced a dual adversary, both a tangible enemy and the all-consuming realization of their dwindling resilience. In the blinding snow and biting cold, camaraderie forged in the crucible of battle began to dangerously fracture under pressure from both the conditions and the growing sense of futility. The once collaborative efforts in launching coordinated strikes against Soviet tanks began to give way to self-preservation instincts. Panic and fear seeped into their ranks, manifesting in whispered discussions and hushed debates about the likelihood of survival. Brotherly bonds frayed under the incessant strain of casualties, failures, and the latent feeling of abandonment by a greater command that seemed disconnected from the horrors unfolding in the trenches. The culmination of these experiences became evident in the testimonies of surviving veterans, who would later recount their experiences with a mixture of nostalgia and bitterness. Many spoke of fleeting victories, isolated incidents of success where the Panzerfaust had scored a kill, amidst a backdrop of incessant despair. The notion of the weapon transitioned from symbolizing hope to encapsulating the profound disillusionment faced during that icy winter, as it stood both as a metaphor for technological advancement and as a harbinger of their crushing defeats on the Eastern Front. Soldiers retold stories of the comrades they lost, tales punctuated by fading accents, desperate glances, and solemn acceptance that emerged through shared experience. They would not let their sacrifices vanish without reflection. In the stark aftermath of the fighting, the Panzerfaust would be remembered not only as a piece of military ingenuity, but also as a bitter reminder of vulnerability, how the intersection of weapon development and battlefield realities can lead to the tragic loss of life. German troops, facing diminished resources, greater enemy coordination, and hazardous conditions, came to embody themes of resignation and despair. They discovered, tragically, that their ingenuity could not compensate for the essential tactical flexibility, support, or cohesion required to endure in the crucible of war. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it is essential to understand the complexities that characterized life on the Eastern Front, where equipment, environment, and human spirit intertwined in a lethal dance. For those drawn to the grim narratives of warfare, the Eastern Front remains not just a battleground of soldiers and strategies, but a poignant reminder of the faceless men who bore the weight of survival amidst the annihilation of war. We invite you to share your thoughts on this compelling topic and suggest new themes for us to explore. Join our community by subscribing for ongoing insights into these essential tales from history. As the chilling winds swept across the frozen landscape of the Eastern Front, German troops grappled with a new weapon that had been heralded as a game-changer in their fight against the Soviet Union: the Panzerfaust. This handheld anti-tank weapon, resembling a simple bazooka, was designed to counter the Soviets' formidable armor while being lightweight and easy to produce. However, as German commanders soon discovered, its operational limits would reveal profound challenges on the battlefield, particularly in the unforgiving conditions and brutal realities that awaited their soldiers. Initial enthusiasm diminished as the weapon's limited range became apparent. Troops quickly found themselves vulnerable to return fire after taking their shots. The sobering truth lay in a tragic paradox. In their bid to innovate, German engineers had created a weapon that, under the right conditions, could disable enemy tanks, but the complexity of the frontline environment rendered such ideals nearly unattainable for the grunts carrying them into combat. The onset of winter in 1944 brought new perils and exacerbated existing obstacles. As Soviet forces regrouped and counteroffensives flourished, the German troops found themselves not only battling the enemy, but also the elements. Snow-covered terrain disguised the deadly ruts and pits that could easily trip a soldier or cause an unsteady fire. The daunting cold, which cut through uniforms and armor alike, drained the morale of troops who had to endure relentless operations with insufficient supplies. The Panzerfaust's promoters had touted its portability, creating a sense of hope among field troops. However, the realities on the ground revealed another layer of complexity. The compact design was practically ideal for urban combat, where members of a squad could navigate through the debris of bombed-out buildings. Yet in vast open fields littered with the remnants of prior battles, the weapon's limited range made it less useful against skirmishing Soviet armored units. If a soldier fired the Panzerfaust at a tank a mere 100 meters away, he may well find himself a target for rapid artillery response or retaliatory assault from vehicles equipped with superior long-range firepower. Operational tactics soon evolved, as frontline officers attempted to exploit the weapon's strengths while adapting to its vulnerabilities. Emphatic communication between units became vital. Commanders resorted to creative solutions to mitigate risk while maximizing the effectiveness of the Panzerfaust. Teams would employ fire-and-move tactics, sending in 1 or 2 soldiers to fire the weapon from behind cover before retreating. Their escape planned meticulously to avoid the heavy retaliation that would invariably follow. Coordinated movements often required precise timing fueled by instinct and experience, relying heavily on reconnaissance to ensure that enemy positions remained in check. However, the stark, cold reality of war meant that these strategies were not infallible. Mistakes were frequently fatal. Soldiers would recount harrowing tales of ambushes, where their hastily assembled teams became trapped in a deadly triangle of fire from well-placed Soviet forces. As the Soviet advance progressed, German command found itself strained. As supply lines dwindled under the pressure of persistent attacks and harsh winter weather, the scarcity of Panzerfausts became evident. Units in dire need of reinforcements soon discovered that while the production of such weapons had surged, the practicalities of warfare often dictated that not every frontline soldier would have the necessary equipment or adequate training to use it effectively. The disparity between expectations and reality widened, as terrified young men faced lethal machines of war cultivated through years of Soviet industrial capacity and tactical refinement. The brief moments of victory scored through the Panzerfaust soon transitioned into instances where inadequate support ultimately led to the loss of equipment and lives. The emotional toll of the battlefield weighed heavily on these troops, whose stories varied from pride over strikes they orchestrated to the haunting heartache of witnessing comrades fall under fire. In the frigid depths of that winter, the Panzerfaust began to embody a dichotomy, laden with promise yet tinged with impending despair. The weapon's utility in limited engagements lent itself to moments of hope. Detailed accounts describe soldiers as they utilized the weapon with crafted precision, securing minor victories while suppressing overwhelming adversities. Yet these fleeting instances could not conceal the larger narrative unfolding as the tide shifted. The relentless push of Soviet forces, bolstered by vast reserves and revitalized strategies. The contrast was profound. While the Panzerfaust offered a glimmer of possible consequence for enemy tanks, it did so at a cost that grew heavier with each passing day of attrition. German units felt their ranks thinning as casualties mounted, forging connections between individual lives. Heavy hearts accompanied every launch of the Panzerfaust, each shot taking not only the aim against enemy armor, but also the laughter and camaraderie that once filled the squads in their heyday. As the harsh winter weather melded into the early thaw of spring, the disillusionment with weapons like the Panzerfaust echoed through the ranks. The initial work of the engineers and the strategic command was beginning to unravel as the soldiers confronted the brutal truth of the Eastern Front, an arena defined by greater forces and more significant failures amidst a backdrop of ambitions that had outpaced reality. German troops were caught in a quagmire, where rapid technological advancements collided with tangible battlefield experiences, producing not only emotional scars and loss of life, but also a growing realization of the incomprehensible complexity of total war. Trust in leadership, once steadfast, began to wane, adding yet another layer of strife to their already stricken morale. The Panzerfaust, as a technology, presented a fascinating case study of the desperate innovation sought by the Third Reich, indeed a testament to the ingenuity that sought to fight against overwhelming odds. Yet within its application lay the haunting reality of human cost and suffering. The war on the Eastern Front remained unrelenting, an arena where technology could not shield soldiers from the broader strokes of fate and the inherent chaos of combat. The painful legacy of the Panzerfaust told an unvarnished story of hope turned to despair, where every moment of tactical maneuvering became intertwined with the cold truths of survival. As we peer into this chapter of warfare, it is crucial to navigate the intricate landscapes of bold decisions, profound consequences, and the unwavering spirit of those caught in the uncertain flow of history. A history forged in valor, but too often marked by loss and sacrifice. The late winter of 1944 found the German forces on the Eastern Front retreating to defensive positions, struggling to hold their ground against the advancing Soviet army. The Panzerfaust, initially hailed as a revolutionary anti-tank weapon due to its simplicity and effectiveness against armored vehicles, quickly revealed its shortcomings against the relentless tides of Soviet power and supply. In the hands of inexperienced infantrymen, the weapon could turn an unsuspecting German soldier into a makeshift hero with a mere pull of the trigger, yet it also transformed into a grim reminder of the increasing desperation that permeated the ranks. The conditions of the Eastern Front forced the German High Command to adapt its tactics rapidly, as the very existence of their military operations became entwined with the limitations of the tools at their disposal. With a maximum effective range of around 30 meters, the Panzerfaust, a lightweight recoilless anti-tank launcher, was designed to exploit close-quarter engagements. However, as the Soviet forces employed strategies aimed at encircling and overwhelming German positions from multiple angles, the reliance on such a short-range weapon proved fatal in numerous encounters. As the offensive tactics of the Red Army matured, particularly from 1943 onward, their combined arms operations became a hallmark of effectiveness, demonstrating a knack for utilizing artillery bombardments to suppress enemy fire while armor advanced quietly behind. German soldiers soon discovered that launching a Panzerfaust at enemy tanks often resulted in return fire that decimated their positions before they had a chance to retreat to relative safety. The logistical challenges of maintaining supplies also exacerbated the dire situation. As the Nazis faced supply line disruptions, the simplistic manufacturing process of the Panzerfaust did little to ease the pressure. Fuel shortages and ammunition scarcity severely hampered operational pathways. German troops, once proud of their mechanized advances on the European battlefield, found themselves vulnerable with limited resources and overextended front lines. Commander Erich von Manstein observed firsthand the failure of the Wehrmacht to adapt effectively. As defensive positions crumbled and losses mounted, the inadequacies of the Panzerfaust became painfully evident. Struggling to maneuver against an enemy employing innovative tactics and superior numbers, the Wehrmacht's hope was fading rapidly. When a squad readied their Panzerfaust, fates intertwined with the precarious balance between perception and reality. Fear gripped their hearts. The successful detonation of one of these warheads would serve momentarily as a morale booster, an exhilarating thrill that turned the tide in individual skirmishes. However, it was quickly overshadowed by the intolerable prospect of being targeted by overwhelming Soviet artillery fire. The tangible weight of combat was a constant shadow, and many German soldiers would speak reverently of the camaraderie established among their ranks, each launch of the Panzerfaust fostering a deep empathy for what was lost, a haunting survival bond amid incessant battle. Operational decisions made at high command often discounted the lived experiences of the soldiers on the front lines, leading to tragedies played out amidst the smoke and chaos. History would later show that the expansive horizons of Soviet mechanized warfare eclipsed the tactical ingenuity of the Panzerfaust in open combat scenarios. In urban environments, however, the weapon found new life. The shattered landscapes of cities like Stalingrad served as the backdrop for close-range encounters, where Panzerfaust operators could leverage their terrain to their advantage. Yet this adaptation came with a grave cost. The loss of life was staggering, both from direct engagements and the resulting bombardments that splintered any semblance of strategy. Amidst the hopelessness, individual tales emerged that provided glimpses into the human condition in wartime. An isolated episode caught on German film archives showcased a young soldier, a typist reassigned to the front lines, firing a Panzerfaust in desperate combat. The adrenaline rushed through his veins as he secured a kill, but as he turned for cover, Soviet artillery found him, a haunting reminder that valor came at an expedient price. Such stories ignited a bitter realism that pervaded the ranks, a recognition that warfare was not merely about the effectiveness of weapons, but also the irrevocable loss that came with them. As winter yielded to the thaw of spring, the soldiers on the Eastern Front were confronted with a new terror, called to hold fast against the approaching winter forces. The stark realization that the Panzerfaust was not a miracle solution, but rather a tool of transient and fleeting effectiveness, painted a bleak picture of desperation and dwindling hope among the infantry. The High Command's faith in rigid strategies meant that adaptations were slow to materialize. Commanders continued to send men into the fray armed with a weapon whose marginal efficiency was eclipsed by the need for urgency in response to evolving tactics from the Soviets. In analyzing the occurrences and tragedies on the front, one cannot overlook the profound psychological toll exacted on the German soldiers. Traditionally bred as practitioners of calculated warfare, many began to experience a disconnection between their military identity and the acts of survival in guerrilla-like settings, where weapon efficacy was defined less by technical specifications and more through the lens of sheer luck against overwhelming odds. Layers of resentment brewed as the survivors' guilt and trauma cascaded through the ranks, fostering an environment of despair. They could no longer find solace in unit pride or patriotism. What became paramount was simply staying alive for another day, clenching a weapon that seemed as likely to condemn them as liberate them. Ultimately, as the narrative surrounding the Panzerfaust revealed, war was not merely a backdrop for tactical genius or technological ingenuity. It was a crucible of human experience where ingenuity met the harsh realities of flesh and metal, creating a surreal theater of war that constantly reminded the men of their own fragile existence. The reality of the Eastern Front required more than just advanced equipment. It demanded an understanding of human valor, resilience, and the sobering truths that stem from the devastating nexus of war. Whether the Panzerfaust would be remembered as a brave response to a dire need or a poignant symbol of missed opportunities, it comprised the ever-growing complexity of the German soldier's journey, a journey marked by courage, loss, and the relentless quest for survival in a world that fell dangerously out of their control. As the winter of 1944 descended upon the Eastern Front, the strife between the German Wehrmacht and the relentless Red Army reached a critical juncture, accentuating the strategic shortcomings of the German command. The Panzerfaust, a handheld anti-tank weapon designed to empower infantry against the Soviet armored might, painted a picture of tactical ingenuity, but also highlighted the glaring limitations that came with desperate measures. As soldiers faced the chilling reality of the war, the Panzerfaust became emblematic of both the tactical innovations that sprang from necessity and the cruel ironies that shaped survival on the front lines. In operational terms, the Panzerfaust offered a promising solution to the Germans' pressing need for effective anti-tank weaponry. Weighing in at just 6 kilograms and with a simple design that allowed for quick deployment, it was intended to counteract the overwhelming Soviet armor that had begun to dominate the battlefield. However, the weapon's limitations soon became apparent. With a maximal effective range of approximately 30 to 50 meters, soldiers were compelled to approach perilously close to enemy tanks, placing themselves at an imminent risk. They became easy targets for returning fire, and the tactics of close-quarter engagements, born from this new necessity, morphed into frenetic clashes where survival often hinged on speed, luck, and sheer desperation rather than military training or strategy. German command, partially blinded by the effective operations they had once executed in previous campaigns, underestimated the shifting dynamics on the Eastern Front. The continued reliance on rigid tactical schemes and the dismissal of adaptive battlefield methodologies resulted in a disillusioned infantry, forced to execute attacks under dire circumstances. Decisions from high command did not account for the evolving nature of Soviet strategies, which became increasingly fluid and unpredictable. Soviet forces applied a combination of mobility, intelligence gathering, and adaptability that German officers struggled to counter. This disconnect placed German troops in a difficult position where their limited resources and suboptimal conditions doomed them to endure heavy losses for minimal gains. Moreover, the psychological ramifications of engaging with the Panzerfaust under constant threat of retaliation manifested profoundly among soldiers. The panic and anxiety that surfaced in the heat of battle colored their experiences. The anticipation of death was omnipresent. The men knew their maneuverability was compromised by the very weapon designed to provide them defense. Those who survived encounters often grappled with varying degrees of trauma, bounding between feelings of invincibility granted by their newly acquired weapon and a consuming dread of their situation. Added to this was the weight of responsibility. Each soldier felt the haunting knowledge that their errant shot might lead to death or dismemberment on both sides. Paradoxically, their newfound sense of empowerment was laced with the stark reality of vulnerability, a potent mixture that evolved mentalities and blurred the lines of fortitude and fragility. The frantic scenarios played out in urban sprawls like Stalingrad and Kiev, where the Panzerfaust's utility became a double-edged sword. Close-quarters combat, the hallmark of urban warfare, favored ambush tactics, which were partially responsive to the effectiveness of the Panzerfaust against armored vehicles. However, even as infantrymen attempted to leverage the weapon's strengths, the rapidly changing fortunes of war eroded their resolve. The Russians learned to anticipate the Germans' tactics, using their knowledge of urban configurations to bait them into ambushes themselves. The environment transformed into a claustrophobic labyrinth, where buildings transcended from protective cover to potential death traps, complicating the straightforward nature of engagement that the infantry had come to depend upon. Logistically, the provision of the Panzerfaust underscored the broader logistical twilight affecting the entire Wehrmacht. As the war dragged on, supply lines frayed under the burden of material shortages, exacerbated by relentless Soviet offensives. The German soldier often found himself in a world lacking basic provisions, while relying on a solution that was never fully integrated into the wider military doctrine. Training for the Panzerfaust was often perfunctory. Once generalized concepts of use had been conveyed, the urgency of the situation left little room for in-depth learning. Consequently, many soldiers approached engagements with outdated expectations rooted in past combat experience, unaware that survival now depended on swift decision-making in dire situations. As this tapestry of chaos and resolution unfolded, the field reports from the front described not only tactical shifts, but also profound human stories emerging from the grim realities of warfare. On one such occasion, a group of German infantrymen, armed to the teeth with Panzerfausts and diving into an assault on opposing armored units, retreated to suburban hideouts after an unexpected encounter with Soviet forces. For them, the lessons echoed through the rubble. The Panzerfaust had not spared them, and worst of all, the price of the initial advances proved devastating. This anguish only compounded when one soldier, having witnessed his comrades fall prey to an indiscriminate counterattack, questioned the very design of their engagement. In his mind, the hope that propelled them forward was drowned in the scars of loss, and the fleeting moments of camaraderie that had tethered them together morphed into numb resignation. The operational environment on the Eastern Front had turned into a living paradox, characterized by mechanical and human elements at odds with one another. As the German High Command clung to tactical hierarchies and command structures, The infantry on the ground struggled amidst rising casualties, shattered morale, and chaotic engagements where the innovative potential of a weapon could not supersede the reality of human vulnerability. Through tragedy and trauma, the Panzerfaust became more than just a weapon. It stood as a testament to the shifting nature of combat, encapsulating the desperation, ingenuity, and frailty of the German soldier's plight as he navigated the unpredictable landscapes of war. Facing an evolving adversary and an uncertain fate, these men bore witness to a conflict that transformed them, every slice of survival stitched together by the fabric of loss that marked their journey. Their struggle exemplified the grim principles of conflict, where technological innovation failed to blend with the unyielding truths of its human operators in the grueling theater of the Eastern Front. As the German forces grappled with the increasingly hostile landscape of the Eastern Front, the Panzerfaust emerged as a double-edged sword, a desperate response to a tactical evolution in armor and counterinsurgency. Designed primarily for ambush and close-quarters engagements, this anti-tank weapon increasingly encountered limitations that led to grim realities for the soldiers who wielded it. Standard accounts of its effectiveness touted the range of the weapon to be approximately 30 yards, far too limiting amidst the vast open battlegrounds where Soviet armor roamed freely and ambushes were often met with devastating returns of fire. This restricted engagement range soon became a tactical liability rather than an advantage, further exacerbated by the Soviets' evolving approaches to mechanized warfare, which increasingly included strategic formations that minimized vulnerability to direct assaults. The initial successes in the field, celebrated by German high command as decisive victories, soon dissolved into perplexing setbacks once frontline troops began to report the dismal realities of the Panzerfaust's engagement limits. Not only did the German soldiers find themselves constrained by the weapon's physical shortcomings, but they also grappled with the evolving tactical dynamism displayed by the Soviets. The Red Army adapted quickly, deploying T-34 tanks that could maneuver swiftly and absorb hits from anti-tank fire, thus rendering the Panzerfaust's initial appeal somewhat hollow amidst the chaos of battlefield engagements. Within snarling clashes, as German infantrymen launched their assaults against Soviet tank units, the dread of return fire loomed large, forcing many to question the very utility of their supposed advantages. Camaraderie turned into a common fear of advancing too close to enemy lines, where the range of their weapons did not afford them the necessary cushion to evade the likelihood of retaliation. Sustained operations along the Eastern Front demanded unconventional tactics adapted to an ever-shifting theater of war. As German commanders introduced the notion of canalization, the strategy of limiting enemy movement along predetermined routes to maximize their own firepower, realities on the ground became significantly more chaotic. Infantry units were tasked with scouting potential ambush sites, while simultaneously coordinating artillery support to create a cohesive plan of attack. However, well-laid plans often crumbled against the unpredictability of frontline engagements. Doppelganger tactics employed by Soviet forces, routine counteroffensives, and mobile armored divisions countered the Germans' rigid maneuvers and left commanding officers to confront a paradox. The higher command sought organized strategy from far, removed war rooms even as the frontline soldiers were locked in visceral combat, characterized by split-second decisions. The aftermath of confrontations was laden with palpable despair. Units that managed to cripple a tank would often find themselves exposed to a barrage of Soviet artillery or machine gun fire, while attempting to withdraw to safety. Losses compounded by the conditions imposed by the environment. The presence of mud-caked winters and scarred urban exteriors rendered an alternative tactical method necessary, calling for the careful consideration of terrain. Strategies that once centered on direct advances now found soldiers adapting to a blend of guerrilla warfare operations as they scavenged for a tactical advantage within crumbling buildings and war-torn streets. It was not uncommon for troops to build improvised fortifications for ambushes or to rely on urban architecture to enhance their defensive positions. The horror of warfare unfolded through the relentless cycle of attack and counterattack, illustrated painfully in the accounts of individual soldiers. One such account detailed an infantryman, barely in his 20s, recalling the searing clang of the Panzerfaust's ignition, a sound of steel echoing into the bitter air, even as he felt the anger coursing through his veins. He had witnessed the fall of his closest comrades when Soviet forces retaliated with concentrated fire from heavy machine guns. There, in that moment, his Panzerfaust became a token of futility, a mere acknowledgement of the likelihood of death spurred on by misplaced certainty and false heroism. The camaraderie that had buoyed their generals' outlines of tactical success fractured into a visceral reality that demanded urgent reckoning. Men relied on one another not only for strength, but also for the emotional fortitude to endure the specter of inevitability. After heavy engagements, the German battalion often found themselves pressing deeper into contested territory, only to retreat under the relentless pressure of redirected Soviet forces. The harshness of terrain, coupled with the reckless use of the Panzerfaust without proper consideration for exposure, led to an increasingly grim atmosphere. Communication faltered amid the din of battle, exacerbated by the chaos of retreat or sudden advance. Crossfire had become a common experience, where friendly fire was dismissed as an afterthought, the human element subsumed by the larger mandate of mechanized warfare. Increasing losses fractured the spirits of the remaining men, urging them to cling to fleeting hopes of reinforcement, which tasted bittersweet in light of the tragic losses already incurred. The stark reality of the Eastern Front exemplified the limitations not only of the Panzerfaust, but also of any mechanized military strategy that underappreciated the essential human component. Where once they operated under the belief that technological advancements could deliver decisive outcomes, the German infantry confronted the existential truth that warfare was fraught with unpredictable variables. One could not fully engineer or predict the human element, frail yet resounding. Battle-weary soldiers in the field began to question not just the efficacy of their weapons, but the overarching purpose of their missions that appeared increasingly detached from the atrocities unfolding in the crumpled remnants of cities and fields. A durable fracture emerged on the Eastern Front. Uncertainty haunted every soldier's heart. As the battle season wore on, the Panzerfaust's presence on the battlefield would never eclipse the profound complexities that governed the human experience of warfare. Each soldier carried their scars beyond the splintered debris of conflict, sewn tightly within their tattered uniforms, a testament to both unity and fragmented hope. Their bodies bore the brunt of physical and psychological scars from a relentless cycle of anticipation and anguish. With every engagement, the Eastern Front became both a testing ground for tactical innovation and, ironically, a crucible that forged enduring narratives of humanity amidst carnage, ultimately reminding every participant that victory is often overshadowed by the price paid in the dark shadow of the battlefield. As the winter of 1943 descended upon the Eastern Front, the German troops found themselves entrenched not just in mud and blood, but in an agonizing re-evaluation of their combat doctrine and equipment. The Panzerfaust, a revolutionary anti-tank weapon issued to infantry units in the latter part of the war, was proving to be both a miracle and a curse. Though compact and easy to use, its effectiveness was hampered by a critical flaw. Its range was notoriously short, often making soldiers vulnerable to counterattacks immediately after using it. Strategically, this flaw began to redefine the dynamics of frontline engagements and alter the balance of power in areas dominated by mechanical warfare. Field commanders, while initially optimistic about the introduction of the Panzerfaust, began to witness firsthand the devastating consequences of its limitations. The infantry tactics intended to leverage this deadly weapon necessitated them to close in on enemy armored vehicles, typically within a range of 20 to 30 meters for effective impact. However, this close proximity often placed German soldiers within the effective range of Soviet artillery and heavy machine guns, which they could not evade once deployed. The realization began to permeate the ranks that such engagement tactics, while revolutionary on paper, lacked the margin of survival necessary for sustained operations. Consequently, the Panzerfaust became emblematic of the desperate measures adopted by an increasingly beleaguered army. The psychological landscape of the Eastern Front was rapidly collapsing under the weight of these tactical dilemmas. Soldiers who had once reveled in the supposed advantages of technological superiority began to experience a profound sense of dread and disillusionment. Each activation of the Panzerfaust, a trigger pulled in defiance of the enemy, was almost immediately followed by the grim acknowledgement of exposure to adversarial fire. The frantic race to reload and reposition before the inevitable barrage descended became an agonizing routine, one that stripped not only the physical, but the emotional fortitude of many who bore arms for the fatherland. Casualties escalated, both from enemy combatants and the unanticipated hazards of friendly fire, wherein fast-moving engagements became a treacherous gamble. Moreover, the logistical implications of continually supplying infantry units with Panzerfausts became a conspicuous challenge as the war dragged on. The German Wehrmacht, once a finely tuned machine of industrial warfare, struggled to maintain streamlined supply routes. The relentless Soviet counteroffensives, typified by strong armored divisions and relentless artillery suppression, disrupted these routes. Consequently, soldiers were often deprived of necessary ammunition, rendering their expensive and expertly engineered weapons effectively useless after expending their initial payload. A sense of despair grew. Prized munitions lay abandoned amidst the rubble, as soldiers, now largely reliant on instinct and interpersonal solidarity, were forced to confront the brutal unpredictability of combat through sheer grit. In the command tents of the German High Command, heated discussions erupted about the Panzerfaust's role in future engagements. Initial assessments envisioned a revolution in infantry capabilities, heralding an age where they could take down tanks without necessitating support from dedicated armored divisions. Yet, as the harsh winter tightened its grip, a stark realization loomed. The enemy adapted fast. Soviet forces began employing decoys and maneuvering tactics that neutralized the surprise elements once afforded to German forces. Moreover, they quickly learned to exploit the weaknesses unveiled by the reliance upon such short-range weapons, deploying their own armaments with effective precision through increased coordination between infantry and armor divisions. The harrowing stories of soldiers in the field painted a stark picture of this evolution in combat. The Eastern Front, with its sprawling landscapes marred by conflict, served as a backdrop for personal tragedies that expressed the broader struggle of an army in decline. Many soldiers recounted harrowing experiences intertwined with moments of heroism spurred by desperation. A young rifleman, Paul, recalled pulling the trigger of his Panzerfaust against an approaching T-34, only to feel the searing heat of artillery explosions showering down, a visceral reminder of his vulnerability. The fleeting sense of accomplishment was hollow, for with every victory came the gnawing realization that comrades lay wounded or dead, their potential futures extinguished in the madness of a war that was consuming its own. The combat environment, the snow-covered expanses of Stalingrad and the desolate plains around Kursk, often turned against the very same men who fought to claim or protect these territories. Soldiers found their morale eroded by the daily grind, battling not only the enemy but also the elements and their own psychological scars. Traumatic experiences became deeply etched into their psyche. The inability to process grief tackled them fiercely with each passing day. Some retreated inward, grappling with the dissonance of duty and morality amid the carnage, while others sought solace in camaraderie, clinging to the few remaining threads of normalcy against the backdrop of brutality. As the war continued to escalate, small victories morphed into fleeting, ethereal achievements overshadowed by the costs incurred. What had once seemed an unstoppable tide for Germany, driven by efficient industrial might and innovative weaponry, had been reduced to a battle for survival at the most basic level. Terrifying exchanges of fire became not just a tactical ordeal, but a visceral expression of the fragility of life in wartime. The fabric of loyalty spun from shared anxieties tightened a little more each day, binding soldiers into a fragile unity. Every soldier who dared to wield the Panzerfaust was acutely aware of the dichotomy they faced. The weapon promised the strength to confront the enemy, yet demanded a ferocious quid pro quo. risking not just life, but one's very humanity in the process. In the cold, bleak stretches of the Eastern Front, hope lingered like smoke in the air, both present and perilously elusive. The promise of technological triumph was eclipsed by the harsh reality of war, a profound reckoning that echoed in every battlefield heartbeat, reminding them that the human cost far outweighed the ephemeral victories that military strategy could boast. In the end, the Panzerfaust, much like the soldiers who wielded it, embodied the complex tapestry of war, a splendid but fragile instrument of destruction, tempered by the inevitable loss it would celebrate.